Welcome to the Happy Mindset. Today's episode is episode number 89, and today's episode title is called Lost in Translation. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about communication. I'm going to talk a little bit around how translation isn't just something that happens between languages. It's also something that happens every day in all of our lives in our own native language, when we're talking to other people in our native language. So the title of this movie comes from the fact that I've watched this movie again, Lost in Translation. It's actually a very interesting movie. It's one of my favorite movies, I think, as well. It really gets you thinking about life. I think the first time I watched it, I wasn't as zoned in on the translation that happens between languages. This movie, it just hits home with the fact that you can be surrounded by a lot of different people in your life, yet still feel isolated and lonely, and like you're not actually being heard by the other person. And so the two characters in this movie, Charlotte and I'm not too sure what the other guy's name was, but it was Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson that were playing the main characters. So there's a sense that these are just two lost souls and that they're connecting amongst the disconnect between what's going on around them, and just this sense as well that they're not being listened to or paid attention to by their significant others, or just the people in their life. So they're at two different stages in their life, but it gives you that sense of, again, how it's possible to have somebody who's surrounded by people every day yet still feel isolated and alone. I guess what this movie helps me to understand too is the positive side to that, in that you can be surrounded in chaos of people just being busy all the time, yet you can still feel calm in yourself, in your own mind, and I guess not get pulled in by the noisiness or the meaningless stuff sometimes that happens in our lives. So that's the contrast to this. It can be quite a depressing state to be in when you're lost and you don't see a way out, or you don't feel any connection with other people. But it also can be a great state of mind to be in when you're comfortable in yourself and you can recognize that you don't have to get always sucked into the madness of what goes on in our day-to-day sometime. So anyway, I'm going to talk about this from the point of view of translating in our own language, in our native language, just to pay attention to that, because that wasn't something that I was familiar with before. When I thought of translation, I would immediately think of two different languages, because that is what translation is seen in the world today, and that's where professions are created. It's translating between languages. But there's also a lot of translation that goes on in our native language, communicating person to person with each other. It's just oftentimes we're not aware of it, we're not conscious of what's actually happening. So I'll just talk about some of the scenarios in your life. I'm going to talk about it from my point of view, as in the stuff that happens in my life that you might be able to relate to, and it might give you a better understanding of why these things keep happening. So for me, for a long time in my life, I didn't even know that I didn't have the language. I didn't have the eyes for this before, and so when I didn't have the language or the eyes for this, it would have just been a general sense of not being heard by myself or by other people, because I didn't feel like what I wanted to express was actually worth expressing. I didn't have the words to express it, which again means that I wouldn't be expressing it because there would be no words there anyway. And that would be the general way I describe it. It was just a sense of me not knowing what I wanted to express, and this general sense of not feeling like anybody was really listening to what I was saying anyway. So it's actually quite a hard thing to describe, especially in today's day and age where people focus a lot on what people say and they cling to their own interpretation of what they said. So they're projecting onto the other person something that they may or may not believe, and they're getting triggered by that, and they're seeing that person as a certain type of person. So I think living in society today, that's one of the things that I really don't like about society. It's just this lack of being able to talk about things in an open way, and be able to talk about things in a real way where we're acknowledging that life isn't perfect. We're not perfect human beings, and we have to in some way learn from all this stuff in a way that's constructive. And so it's not helpful when people project things onto one another or don't listen properly. So this is what it's coming down. This is what it's coming down to. This, I guess, I'm getting to it by talking this out. Actually, it's so when I talk about like we're translating between things, it's usually because when we say certain words will trigger certain people, and because they're triggered, they don't hear what you're actually saying. They'll hear their interpretation of what you're saying more so than what you're actually saying. And I can understand this too, because I used to think that when I'm in a conversation with somebody, that there's no layer in between it of what I'm hearing and what they're saying. I just thought it was like real-time communication. I'm hearing exactly what they're saying and I'm hearing exactly what they're meaning. But that's not how communication actually works. I spent a long time developing my capacity to listen better, and that's something that I continue to try and improve, because it's actually a lot harder than I initially thought it was because of this translation layer that I wasn't aware of before. So the translation layer, it basically is that you're listening to things with your own assumptions, your own biases. There's a whole layer of things that are like in the way of like clean communication with somebody else, and your judgments as well. That's another hard one. It's like whether, like, a lot of time it's not even intentional. You'll just put a judgment on somebody else because you judge a certain thing a certain way, and you'll hold that judgment for yourself too, and that will actually limit you. Those are things I've experienced too, and it's judgments I've taken on that I've just picked up on over time, and they haven't served me to judge myself in that way, and they haven't definitely not served me to judge other people that way. So they're unconscious biases that are there, and but I guess the flip side is that they're things that you can work through. So that's the translation layer there. That's what I wanted to talk about today. I'd recommend giving that movie a watch if you're somebody who's interested in learning more about connection, human connection, and learning about like how can people feel lonely around a bunch of people. So that movie actually it's quite fascinating. I like the director as well. I watched an interview of Sofia Coppola, I think I pronounced that right. Hopefully I pronounced that right. But she talks about how she approached directing films and creativity from the point of view that she never had to depend on it for money, and she didn't want that either because she wanted it to be a creative project. And so I resonate with that because I've gone through a lot of struggle around in my own mind about what I'm doing, that I shouldn't be doing it unless I'm earning income from it, or what's the point of doing it just for the sake of doing it. These types of things, because I've often felt naive. I felt like this is childish, just doing this. Like, actually just saying it, just speaking it out, it sounds weird, but they're the types of conflicts that were in my mind, and they were based off of my unconscious assumptions and biases. So that's how I'm starting to unravel these things, is by doing things that for some reason or another make me feel uncomfortable, or saying things as well that might, like, I'll notice myself that my urge to filter myself, because again, I guess it comes back to the translation layer, that I know if I say a certain thing, I mightn't actually intend it to be interpreted by somebody in a certain way, but it is, because I've no control over that. The only thing I can really control is my intention and how I'm listening to people. So that's been the most helpful for me, is to be aware that it's actually more important for me to listen as much as it is to just speak out things that I'm working through and things that I have figured out for myself that can be of value to other people, to help them with their psychological struggles and conflicts in their mind as well in some way. So that resonated with me, because for me, creativity, when you're not dependent on money from it, it allows you to express yourself creatively without any filter or lens that would otherwise kind of corrupt it. So like it or not, if you're doing something and one of its foundations are based around an income having to come from it, then you will have to look at it through that lens, whether you like it or not, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. It's going to frame how you say things and how you interact and communicate. But if you are not dependent on your creativity for a certain income, then it's a lot easier to just express yourself more fully, and to create things that feel aligned to you creatively, that are things that you would create anyway. And that's the nature of creating something for no other reason than to create and get people thinking, and to give yourself, like, I guess what I've gotten from creating is this sense of aliveness, I guess, from it. And it allows me to think about things in a constructive way. So I've always had that within me, this capacity to just think deeply about things, but I wasn't using it constructively for a long time in my life. I was using it aimlessly, and it was quite destructive and quite toxic. And so now that I have an outlet for that, it allows me to feel more alive. And even when I watch movies and stuff as well, I'm looking at things in different ways that I wouldn't have any need to look at otherwise. So I'm looking at it and I'm like, what's this person trying to get across? And it feels good to me, because it's like I'm trying to understand other people. I'm trying to understand different perspectives of life. And for me, that's really engaging. That's a really kind of curious approach to life that I didn't have before. And when I didn't have it, like, just life didn't feel like there was much of a direction for me. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about today. It's very hard actually to describe the things that get lost in translation, because another thing to keep in mind is that most of communication is actually nonverbal. I've heard that said a lot of times, but the more I move forward with things, the more I realize that is true. That it's the feeling that you bring to things, and it's your intentions, and it's just your confidence in things, your conviction. They're a lot more important than the words you use. The words are important as well to actually articulate things. So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg. Like, when you don't have the words to express yourself, it's hard to feel confident about what you think and what you want to create. Like, words are necessary to create things, because if you didn't have words to articulate things, you couldn't communicate things with other people. I wouldn't have the artwork, my podcast. I wouldn't have a book. I wouldn't have anything if I didn't have words. But if I didn't have the other things, if I didn't pay attention to them, like, how am I feeling about doing this? Like, how do I want my listeners to feel? Then that's very limiting too. There's not much power to that. That's something that I've been more intentional about as well. So that's what I wanted to draw attention to today. Like, if you've got certain situations in your life where you just feel like people don't listen to you, it's just to acknowledge that that's normal, that's a normal part of the human experience. That doesn't have to be a reality forever. The best way I found to go about changing things is to work on yourself. Like, start realizing how often are you listening to people. So instead of looking at it from the point of view of fixing it in a way, instead of looking at it from the point of view of you need to make other people hear you, just inverse it and think, how do I hear other people better? Because if you're in those situations and you feel like you're not being heard and you're just getting more and more frustrated, then trying to get the other person to listen to you probably won't work, especially if you're frustrated. It'll just make things worse. So inverse it and go, how do I start listening to people better? And then over time, you'll start to understand people better, and you'll start to understand too what types of people you like to communicate with and who you're most interested in. And as well, a byproduct of all this is that you become more confident in yourself, because you'll start noticing how much of space you were filling just talking for the sake of it because you weren't secure in yourself. And you'll also start noticing the reasons why you needed to be heard by the other person in the first place, like what you were looking for in that situation. Like, for me, oftentimes it's been that I haven't understood myself, I haven't been comfortable with myself, so I needed that from somebody else. So when you start seeing that, then you start seeing how much of that you can actually start changing and transforming in your life. And then Like, it's a rarity as well to actually find people that really listen to you, especially when you're talking about stuff that you're stuck in. If you're talking about your problems, if you're talking about stuff that you're ashamed or embarrassed about, if you find somebody who actually listens to you in a non-judgmental way, they're a rare diamond in the rough. So the best way then is to become that person for other people. And in turn, like, it's like reciprocity. Like, people reciprocate. So if you're somebody who wants to be heard more, then listen more to people, because you'll be heard more then, because you'll get that sense and they'll reciprocate over time. So that's Lost in Translation. I'd recommend giving that movie a watch, and just to be mindful of this. This isn't an easy thing. For the first 22 years of my life, I wasn't even aware that this was a thing. Even though I'd been studying languages and stuff, I wasn't fully aware that this was a thing that was going on. And I hope that that's been a benefit to you today, and that it's something, maybe if it's something new to you, it's something you can play with and experiment with. And my number one actionable tip from today, from today's podcast, is to just set that intention to listen more to other people, and maybe speak a bit less as well. Just see how that feels, and see what changes in your life as well. So thanks again for listening, and I will see you on the next episode.